Hello everybody! Today I'm going to talk about session 22, so let's go ahead and get started. I am Ra. I greet you in the love and in the light of the infinite creator. I communicate now. Questioner. The instrument would like to ask a couple questions of you. I'll get them out of the way first. The instrument would like to know why she smells the incense at various times during the day in various places. I am Ra. This instrument has spent a lifetime in dedication to service. This has brought this instrument to this nexus in space-time with the conscious and unconscious distortion towards service, with the further conscious distortion towards service by communication. Each time, as you would put it, that we perform this working, our social memory complex vibrational distortion meshes more firmly with this instrument's unconscious distortions towards service. Thus, we are becoming a part of this instrument's vibratory complex, and it a part of ours. This occurs upon the unconscious level, the level whereby the mind has gone down through to the roots of consciousness, which you may call cosmic. This instrument is not consciously aware of this slow changing of the meshing vibratory complex. However, as the dedication on both levels continues, and the workings continue, there are signals sent from the unconscious in a symbolic manner. Because this instrument is extremely keen in its sense of smell, this association takes place unconsciously, and the thought form of this odor is witnessed by the entity. So we know from session 2 that the group burns an incense per Ra's suggestion when they do this working. So when Dawn asks why she smells the incense at various times during the day in various places, I'm guessing they're referring to the incense that they use when they're contacting Ra. So because she is becoming more and more meshed with the Ra complex, her subconscious creates the illusion of smelling this incense as a signpost, maybe a reminder of this work that she's doing. To maybe, I would guess maybe part of it is to just keep her in the right frame of mind of being prepared to do this contact. At this point, we're on session 22 and it's February 10th, so they've been doing this for less than a month. They've done 22 sessions in less than a month, so they've fully immersed themselves in the Ra contact and orienting their lives around this work. And Carla in particular is the main driver, the person who has the most direct connection then with Ra, because when she leaves her body, Ra comes and takes her consciousness to where they are in sixth density. So more and more Carla is becoming a part of the Ra complex, and this is affecting her subconsciously and consciously. And so essentially this hallucination of the smell of incense is just a reminder of this choice that she's making more and more firmly to be of service in this way, being an instrument for Ra, communicating Ra's message for them. So in 22.2, Dawn says, secondly, she would like to know why she feels more healthy now after she does these sessions. She's generally feeling more healthy as time goes on. I am Ra. This is a function of the free will of the entity. This entity has, for many of your years, prayed a certain set of sound vibration complexes before opening to communication. Before the trance state was achieved, this prayer remained within the conscious portion of the mind complex and, though helpful, was not as effective as the consequence of this prayer, as you would call this vibrational sound complex, which then goes directly into the unconscious level, thus more critically affecting the communication from the spiritual complex. Also, this entity has begun, due to this working, to accept certain limitations which it placed upon itself in order to set the stage for services such as it now performs. This also is an aid to realigning the distortions of the physical complex in regard to pain. So here we have some pretty important points, I think. So the prayer that Ra is referring to is the prayer of St. Francis, which I think most people are familiar with, even if that doesn't necessarily recall a specific set of words. But the prayer of St. Francis is the one that goes, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born again into eternal life. So that prayer is really about the magic of changing consciousness, of taking something from one state to the next state, from despair to hope, and being a vehicle of that. I say that prayer every day as well. I think it's a wonderful prayer, and Carla used this prayer before her channeling. So when she would consciously channel before Ra, she said this prayer, and now she's saying this prayer as she goes into trance and the Ra contact begins. So this prayer is sinking more and more into her subconscious and affecting her unconsciously and having an effect on her spiritual complex that is alleviating some of the physical distortions that she's experiencing. My guess is, she has such a framework of martyrdom. And I think that this prayer isn't really about being a martyr. It's about really embracing the honor duty of being a vessel. And so it is helping her. So the second aspect here, then, of Carla feeling stronger because of her work doing these sessions, is that she has accepted the limitations that have been placed upon her body complex pre-incarnationally. Essentially, a lot of her health problems actually come from she was born with a lot of birth defects, and also when she was 12, she wanted to die, and she willed herself to death, and then had an NDE where she was given the choice of either splitting her catalyst over 2 lifetimes or coming back to the one that she had tried to leave and finishing out her life plan. And she obviously came back. But something about this process has allowed her to say, oh, okay, everything is divine timing, everything has happened for a reason. My physical complex has been weak and frail, but look at also what it's able to do. Look at this magical work that is able to come through this frail body. But all of it was, intentionally planned to bring her to this point in time where the group is able to channel Ra. And so this conscious realization has allowed an acceptance for the limitations of her body complex. And that acceptance of limitations is, as Ra says, an aid to realigning the distortions of the physical complex with regard to pain. So much of the pain that we feel in our body is because of a resistance to the lack of health that we are feeling, and the frustration from these limitations that lack of health puts upon us. So the more we accept that, the more we consciously accept that it's okay to not feel perfectly strong 100% of the time, and that there are legitimate reasons that we're trying to learn from ourselves through this lack of health, that allows the body complex to readjust because you're leaning into acceptance instead of resistance or rejection. And unfortunately, this is pretty much probably the peak of Carla's health during this contact. After this, it starts to go downhill quite a bit. But as of this point in time, she's feeling very strong and healthy and purposeful, and it's working for her. So in 22.3, Dawn says, thank you. I'll ask a couple of questions to clear up the end of the second cycle, the second major cycle, and then we'll go on to the third and last of the major cycles. Can you tell me the average lifespan at the end of the second major cycle? I am Ra. By the end of the second major cycle, the lifespan was as you know it, with certain variations among geographically isolated peoples, more in harmony with intelligent energy, and less bellicose. So Dawn's going to continue to ask about this, but essentially here Ra's saying that by the end of the second cycle, we'd gotten to where we essentially are now with our lifespan. But there were isolated groups who were able to enjoy the longer third density lifespan. And in 22.4, then, Dawn asks, can you tell me the length of the average span in years at the end of the second major cycle? I am Ra. The average is perhaps misleading. To be precise, many spent approximately 35 to 40 of your years in one incarnation, with the possibility not considered abnormal of a lifespan approaching 100 of your years. So, pretty on par for where we are. 35 to 40 is pretty young to die, but, it isn't unheard of to die of things like a heart attack or a stroke in your 40s or 50s for sure, this day and age. But it might actually be considered a bit abnormal to reach a lifespan of 100 years right now. I mean, more and more people are, but I don't think most people expect to. 100 years is a pretty long life at this point, but pretty close to where we are now is where we ended the second major cycle. So, 22.5, Dawn asks, then can you give me can I assume then that this drastic drop from 700-year lifespan to one less than 100 years in length during this second 25,000-year period was because of an intensification of a condition of lack of service to others? Is this correct? I am Ra. This is in part correct. By the end of the second cycle, the law of responsibility had begun to be effectuated by the increasing ability of entities to grasp those lessons which there are to be learned in this density. Thus, entities had discovered many ways to indicate a bellicose nature, not only as tribes or what you call nations, but in personal relationships, each with the other, the concept of barter having given way in many cases to the concept of money. Also, the concept of ownership having won ascendancy over the concept of non-ownership on an individual or group basis. Each entity then was offered many more subtle ways of demonstrating either service towards others or service to self with the distortion of the manipulation of others. As each lesson was understood, those lessons of sharing, of giving, of receiving in free gratitude, each lesson could be rejected in practice. Without demonstrating the fruits of such learned teaching, the lifespan became greatly reduced, for the ways of honor duty were not being accepted. So here again we have the law of responsibility. This might be the first time that Ra actually says that phrase, the law of responsibility. But as we've talked about before, if you're not grasping the lessons which are to be learned in this density, you have a reduction in your potential lifespan, because to the Logos, this lifetime becomes relatively useless, which seems like a harsh thing to say, but it seems like that's the perspective of this evolutionary process that we're experiencing. So as they had more and more opportunity to choose polarity, if they weren't putting those choices into practice, they weren't utilizing their catalyst. So by the end of the second cycle, many beings knew of the potential for these two choices, whether it's freely giving or manipulating and taking. And most beings were not doing either of those things to a harvestable degree. So this greatly shortened the lifespan. And, it seems like it requires that bellicosity, that awareness of the service to self pull to reduce the lifespan, because obviously during the first cycle, we still had 700 years, but nobody was harvested. But our lifetimes at the end of the cycle were still up to 700 years. So it really is the more we choose to engage with those negative thought forms and not the positive thought forms, this reduces the life expectancy of the collective. And I would like to point out too here that Ra does seem to say that the concept of barter is on one end of the spectrum and the concept of money is on the other end of the spectrum, and the concept of non-ownership is on one end of the spectrum, and the concept of ownership is on the other end of the spectrum. So here in our late stage capitalist society, we've obviously perfected this. We've perfected the use of money and ownership, and that is a lot of what people push back against is these energies. But we had them at the end of our second cycle, so we've had them for at least 25,000 years on our planet, and like I said, we've just been more and more increasing the energies of those potentials, which is probably why we still have the same kind of lifespan, because we're still kind of doing the same thing. So in 22.6, Don asks, would this shortened lifespan help the entity in any way, and that he would have more at times in between incarnations to review his mistakes, or would this shortened lifespan hinder him? I am Ra. Both are correct. The shortening of the lifespan is a distortion of the law of one, which suggests that an entity not receive more experience in more intensity than it may bear. This is only in effect upon an individual level and does not hold sway over planetary or social complexes. Thus, the shortened lifespan is due to the necessity for removing an entity from the intensity of experience which ensues when wisdom and love are, having been rejected, reflected back into the consciousness of the Creator without being accepted as part of the self. This then causing the entity to have the need for healing and much evaluation of the incarnation. The incorrectness lies in the truth that, given appropriate circumstances, a much longer incarnation in your space-time continuum is very helpful for continuing this intensive work until conclusions have been reached through the catalytic process. So essentially here Ra is saying that, yes, the law of responsibility, reducing the lifespan on an individual level, is to help protect that individual consciousness from too much trauma of one lifetime with too much unprocessed catalyst. So the less you're able to process your catalyst, the more you build up trauma, but then, of course, the quicker you get to your in-between life process where there's a lot of healing and reflection, and your guides are there to help you work through all of this catalyst that you weren't able to do while you were incarnated. However, in general, it is much more valuable to the growth and greater awareness and experience of an entity to have that longer third density lifetime, if that lifetime is available, and if they're consciously working with their catalyst and working to find a greater understanding of the self through that catalyst. So it is a protective thing. It isn't like a punishment. It isn't like, oh, you're not polarizing enough, you don't get to live anymore. It's you're not integrating your lessons, and the lessons are so intense and traumatic here on this planet that you can't just have 900 years of unintegrated catalyst. It seems like a lot of people who refuse to integrate their catalyst top out at like 40 to 50 years, as Ra was saying earlier. And again, that's not uncommon in this experience. And also, I just want to say too, I don't think that everybody who quote unquote dies prematurely is dying prematurely because they aren't working with their catalyst properly. I think everyone has their own plan for their incarnation, and maybe some people have just chosen that length of time to be here for other reasons that don't revolve around not integrating their catalyst. So I don't want this, I don't want to seem like I'm judging people who have a shortened lifespan for whatever reason. But these are the things that Ra says about how we integrate catalyst and the consequences of not integrating our catalyst. So in 22.7, Don says, you spoke of the South American group that was harvestable at the end of the second cycle. How long was their average lifespan at the end of the second cycle? I am Ra. This isolated group had achieved lifespans stretching upwards towards the 900-year lifespan appropriate to this density. So they were isolated, and their culture had less bellicosity, so their lifespan was longer, was toward the upper limit of what a third density lifespan is supposed to look like. In 22.8, Don says, then I'm assuming the planetary action that we're experiencing now, which shortens, it seems, all lifespans here, was not strong enough at that time to affect them and shorten their lifespan, regardless. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. It is well to remember that at that nexus in space-time, great isolation was possible. So obviously here, in our current time, isolation is not possible at all. In fact, there are some very few uncontacted tribes out there, and more in modern day, people are trying to find backdoor ways to contact them. I don't know if you've seen it, but there are like Christian groups who have gone to the areas where there are uncontacted or low contacted tribes and will place speakers with playback devices playing things like the Bible for these cultures, these peoples to hear. And, I think in that case, a lot of the time this is with mostly good intentions, because I think a lot of Christians have a belief that you have to give up your life to Jesus to be saved and make it to heaven. And they don't realize that that's a metaphor and not something that needs to be literal. I think they are genuinely trying to help save these cultures, but, today very few people have the option of any sort of isolation. We're more and more a global consciousness, and we have access to awareness and knowledge of all cultures and experiences and current events as they happen. So we all have more of a collectively shared potential lifespan, whereas back then, cultural isolation could allow a longer lifespan. So 22.9, Dawn asks, about how many people populated the Earth totally at that time? That is, incarnated in the physical at any one time. I am Ra. I am assuming that you intend the query regarding the number of incarnate mind-body-spirit complexes at the end of the second major cycle. This number being approximately 345,000, 345,000 entities. So that's a very small number. In 2210, then, Dawn asks, approximately how many were harvestable out of the total number? I am Ra. There were approximately 150 entities harvestable. So we have talked about that before. During the first time we had any sort of harvest was the end of the second cycle, and it was a grand total of 150 entities. And as Dawn goes on in the next question, says, a very small number. Then as the next cycle started, are these the entities that then stayed to work on the planet? I am Ra. These entities were visited by the Confederation and became desirous of remaining in order to aid the planetary consciousness. This is correct. Questioner. What type of visit did the Confederation make to this group of 150 entities? I am Ra. A light being appeared bearing that which may be called a shield of light. It spoke of the oneness and infinity of all creation and of those things which await those ready for harvest. It described in golden words the beauties of love as lived. It then allowed a telepathic linkage to progressively show those who were interested the plight of third density when seen as a planetary complex. It then left. So, at the time of harvest, these 150 entities were greeted by a Confederation entity who did a mind link with them, showed them the plight of the peoples on the planet, reinforced this ideal that once beings are harvested, I'm guessing, this is sort of a concept of heaven, right? This might be when the concept of heaven became a part of our social memory complex even, to talk about those things which await those ready for harvest. There's a lot of benefits to moving into fourth density. No more disharmony, no more suffering. And these are the things that we associate with heaven, or as Christians also refer to it, the kingdom of God, which is supposed to come after Jesus comes again. So these beings were inspired to stay, to try to help us, those of us who remained in confusion. And so 2213, Dawn asks, and did all of these entities then decide to stay and help during the next 25,000 year cycle? I am Ra. This is correct. As a group, they stayed. There were those peripherally associated with this culture which did not stay. However, they were not able to be harvested either, and so, beginning at the very highest, shall we say, of the suboctaves of third density, repeated this density. Many of those who have been of a loving nature are not wanderers, but those of this particular origin of second cycle. So here Ra is saying, I've always kind of took this question to mean, many of those who have been of a loving nature are not wanderers, but those of this particular origin of second cycle. I always took that as Ra referring to the 150 who were harvested and stayed, but I think upon a closer reading that Ra's actually saying that those who are even in the culture alongside these 150 harvestable entities were also highly polarized, though not yet harvestable. And so a lot of them are the beings that we know in our history as being loving beings because they had already been a part of a very harmonious culture. So in 2214 then, Dawn asks, are all of these entities still with us in this cycle? I am Ra. The entities repeating the third density major cycle have, in some few cases, been able to leave. These entities have chosen to join their brothers and sisters, as you would call these entities. So here again, I believe Ra is referring to the unharvestable entities who existed with the 150 who were technically harvested but still stayed on the earth plane. Some of them have also reached harvest, at least in some few cases have been able to leave. I believe that actually means indigo ray penetration, meaning that they get to harvest whenever they want. Or it could be talking about at the very end here where we are, 1981, the harvest is close enough that maybe they were then able to make it through to the third density harvest. But it sounds like most of them are still here with us. So, 2215, Dawn asks, were any of these entities names that we know from our historical past, that have appeared as incarnated beings we find in our history? I am Ra. The one known as sound vibration complex, St. Augustine, is of such a nature. The one known as St. Teresa, of such a nature. The one known as St. Francis of Assisi, of such nature. These entities, being of monastic background, as you would call it, found incarnation in the same type of ambiance appropriate for further learning. So these are pretty well-known saints. In fact, we just said the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi a little bit ago, which is a very purely intentioned prayer. So then we have St. Augustine and St. Teresa, which is not the modern controversial St. Teresa that I'm sure almost all of us know of and are aware of. It's a saint from the 16th century who was very prolific in writing books, talked a lot about meditation. In general, if you look into her, she's very much has that wanderer energy. Even though she isn't technically a wanderer, she's on that sort of in-between line of being a fully awakened being who is incarnating with a mission, essentially. And here I was saying, too, that they incarnated in a monastic situation where they were focused on the divine, on reverence, on prayer, on meditation, on service, and this was beneficial to them and allowed them to flourish into a lifetime where they became very well known in our historical records. So, in 2216, Dawn asks, well, then, as the cycle terminated 25,000 years ago, what was the reaction of the Confederation to the lack of harvests? I am Ra. We became concerned. Questioner. Was any action taken immediately, or did you wait for a call? I am Ra. The Council of Saturn acted only in allowing the entry into third density of other mind-body-spirit complexes of third density, not wanderers, but those who sought further third density experience. This was done randomly so that free will would not be violated, for there was not yet a call. So, my guess is here is that this means that this is when we started having more of an influx of other planetary complexes that were not Earth, Mars, and Maldek, who came here to incarnate on our planet. So this was one way that the Council of Saturn was able to do something without infringement upon our free will, or at least so they thought, if that's what Ra's referring to, I'm guessing. So it was randomly done. It wasn't like they favored more polarized third density groups, but those who needed to come to a different third density for the various reasons, like we've talked about before, like Deneb's sun was too old to allow the planet to cycle through a third density experience, or maybe other places for whatever reason that destroyed their planet like Mars and Maldek did. These beings started incarnating on Earth. I'm guessing that's what this is referring to, considering before this point in time, we only had some 300-something thousand Earthlings, Martians, Maldekians incarnating at any time. So, 2218, Dawn asks, was the next action taken by the Confederation when a call occurred? I am Ra, this is correct. Questioner, who or what group produced this call and what action was taken by the Confederation? Ra says, the calling was that of Atlanteans. This calling was for what you would call understanding, with the distortion towards helping other selves. The action taken is that which you take part in at this time, the impression of information through channels, as you would call them. Questioner, was this first calling then at a time before Atlantis became technologically advanced? I am Ra, this is basically correct. So, before Atlantis became too technologically advanced, for their own good apparently, they began calling for an understanding with a side of desire to help other selves. And so this is when the Confederation started being channeled in Atlantis, and that's how they made contact with the Atlanteans the first time that they called, which is the first time that they were able to answer the call on Earth directly, was there in Atlantis. So 22.21, Dawn says, then did the technological advancement of Atlantis come because of this call? I am assuming the call was answered to bring them the Law of One and the Law of Love as a distortion of the Law of One, but did they also then get technological information that caused them to grow into such a highly technological society? I am Ra. Not at first. At about the same time as we first appeared in the skies over Egypt and continuing thereafter, other entities of the Confederation appeared unto Atlanteans who had reached a level of philosophical understanding, shall we misuse this word, which was consonant with communication, to encourage and inspire studies in the mystery of unity. However, requests being made for healing and other understandings, information was passed having to do with crystals and the building of pyramids, as well as temples, as you would call them, which were associated with training. So, it wasn't until on the time scale that Ra was visiting Egypt, it was later in the Atlantean experience that other entities of the Confederation began to appear to the Atlanteans, who they thought would be able to integrate their presence and their teachings. And so they wanted more information about healing, and so the Confederation gave them information about crystals and building pyramids. And so 22.22, Dawn asks, was this training the same type of initiatory training that was done with the Egyptians? I am Ra. This training was different in that the social complex was more, shall we say, sophisticated and less contradictory and barbarous in its ways of thinking. Therefore, the temples were temples of learning rather than the attempt being made to totally separate and put upon a pedestal the healers. So here Ra is saying that in Egypt, their culture was still very violent, but they had segregated this sort of divine portion of their culture into temples and priests who were trained to and completely ascetic and being able to be pure vessels of divinity in relation to the rest of the culture, which did not have that level of purity. However, it sounds like Atlantis was less violent, more sophisticated, shall we say. And so the temples were more open to everybody instead of only open to those who were chosen to be divine or had exhibited qualities of divinity, that the temples were about lifting everybody up, about teaching others so that anyone could access this information, versus in Egypt where the healers were totally separate and put upon a pedestal, as Ross says here. So in 22:23, Dawn asks, then were there what we call priests trained in these temples? I am Ra. You would not call them priests in the sense of celibacy, of obedience, and of poverty. They were priests in the sense of those devoted to learning. The difficulties became apparent as those trained in this learning began to attempt to use crystal powers for those things other than healing, as they were involved not only with learning, but became involved with what you would call the governmental structure. So we have some benefits and drawbacks to this situation, whereas in Egypt, the healers were put on a pedestal and separated. That caused its own problems. But in Atlantis, the healers were just learned teachers, essentially. They weren't separated from the rest of the culture. So a lot of these people who received this knowledge did other things, like join the government. And so being a part of the government, then your priorities become kind of shifted and often usually very skewed. So they were using this spiritual knowledge that they had acquired to go beyond healing and to do things that benefited them politically. So in 2224, Dawn asks, was all of their information given to them in the way that you're giving our information now, through an instrument such as this instrument? I am Ra. There were visitations from time to time, but none of importance in the, shall we say, historical passage of events in your space-time continuum. So, they had some landings in Atlantis, but those didn't persist and have ripples through our collective like the landings in especially Egypt and also South America had. So 2225, Dawn asks, was it necessary for them to have a unified social complex for these visitations to occur? What conditions were what conditions were necessary for these visitations to occur? I am Ra. The conditions were two: the calling of a group of people whose square overcame the integrated resistance of those unwilling to search or learn. The second requirement, the relative naivete of those members of the Confederation who felt that direct transfer of information would necessarily be as helpful for Atlanteans as it had been for the Confederation entity. So again, we're talking about the first civilization to make the call that was able to be answered by the Confederation. And the Confederation entities who answered had a similar situation where they made a calling and beings came and walked among them and taught them and helped lift their society up. So the Confederation believed, who had had this experience, that this would also be beneficial to the Atlanteans. However, as Ross says, that it was naive of them to make this assumption. And again, this is just the first experience of the Confederation walking among Earth that ultimately ended in a catastrophe. So 2226, Dawn says, I see then. What you're saying is these naive Confederation entities had the same thing happen to them in the past, so they were doing the same thing for the Atlantean entities. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is correct. We remind you that we are one of the naive members of that Confederation and are still attempting to recoup the damage for which we feel responsibility. It is our duty, as well as honor, to continue with your peoples. Therefore, until all traces of the distortions of our teach learnings have been embraced by their opposite distortions and balance achieved. So, we get another kind of defensive response from Ra. We remind you we are one of those naive members of the Confederation who meddled with your social memory complex, thought we were helping, that it was going to be a net positive with our interventions, but we actually caused a lot of problems that we're still trying to fix from our involvement 11,000 years ago or whenever it was that Ra came to our planet. So, again, Earth is anomalous in many ways, and the way that we have twisted all interventions from higher density beings into violent catastrophes is one of those ways. It wasn't expected by the Confederation because most of them had positive experiences with this same thing. So Ra, this is part of their attempts at balancing, and I'm assuming the other social memory complexes who have been here have their own missions of attempting to balance, but those missions do not involve actually landing on Earth again because too many things have gone wrong, and we're already in the process of moving into fourth density positive. We just have to finish that process out on our own without any direct help. And again, not on our own. They're helping us in a lot more unseen ways. But actually coming down and landing and trying to do something to fix or help us, they're probably not going to do that again. I don't think that they're going to do that again. So 2227, Dawn says, I see. Then I will state the picture I have now of Atlantis, and you can tell me if I'm correct. We have a condition where a large number of the entities of Atlantis had started at least going in the direction of the Law of One, and living the Law of One, for their call to be heard by the Confederation. This call was heard because, using the Law of Squares, it overrode the opposition of the Atlantean entities that were not calling. The Confederation then used channels such as we use now for communication and also made contact directly, but this turned out to be a mistake because it was perverted by some of the entities of Atlantis. Is this correct? And Ra says, this is correct with one exception. There is only one law. That is the Law of One. Other so-called laws are distortions of this law, some of them primal, and most important for progress to be understood. However, it is well that each so-called law, which we also call way, be understood as a distortion rather than a law. There is no multiplicity to the Law of One. This will be the final question in length of this working. Please ask it now. So here, Dawn is just summarizing what they've gone over in this session. The Atlanteans made a call. The call was heard by the Confederation. The Law of Squares overrode the entities who were not calling, and then the Confederation was able to reach out, and this did not end up as a positive for the Atlanteans. And Ross says, yep, that's correct, but they emphasize then that there aren't multiple laws, it's just the Law of One, and then there are distortions of the Law of One. And I'm struggling then with Dawn's question to find out why Ra had to clarify that there's only one law. There's only the Law of One. But Ra felt the need to emphasize that after Dawn's question. And so we have 2 questions left. We have 22.28, and Dawn asks, what was the only question I was going to ask that I can think of was, could you give me the average lifespan of the Atlantean population? I am Ra. The average lifespan, as we have said, is misleading. The Atlanteans were, in the early part of their cultural experience, used to lifespans from 70 to 140 years, this being, of course, approximate. Due to increasing desire for power, the lifespan decreased rapidly in the later stages of the civilization and, thus, the healing and rejuvenating information was requested. Do you have any brief queries before we close? So, the beginning of the time contacting the Atlanteans, their lifespan was longer. By the end of the time that the Confederation was working with the Atlanteans, their lifespan had decreased, their lifespan had decreased, which then increased the calling for the healing information that was then given to the Atlanteans as well. So, final question, Dawn asks, is there any way that we can make this instrument more comfortable or anything we can do for her? I am Ra. The instrument is well. It is somewhat less easy to maintain clear contact during a time when some or one of the entities in the circle of working is or are not fully conscious. We request that entities in the circle be aware that their energy is helpful for increasing the vitality of this contact. We thank you for being conscientious in the asking. I am Ra. It is a great joy to leave you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai. So here Ra is saying that it would be great if everyone stayed awake while the contact was going on, and the person who actually fell asleep was Leonard. Leonard was part of the first session, and this is the second session that Leonard was a part of, and then the last session that Leonard was a part of. But Leonard was there, and Leonard fell asleep, and apparently that was not ideal. So I think this may have been the last time they let anyone join them, actually, in their sessions. According to Jim and Tilting at Widmills, I'll just read this little paragraph where I got the information that it was Leonard who fell asleep. Gary asks, who beyond you two and Dawn attended an actual Raw session? Jim, there were 3 people. They were all good friends of Dawn and Carla, and eventually of me. There was Sally D., Carla's ex-husband's second wife, and Carla's best friend at the time. Sally attended 1 session. And then there was Leonard Cecil, the fellow who was learning to channel when the first session of the Raw contact happened. He came to 2 sessions. He was the one who went to sleep later on when Ra spoke about that it would be handy if people didn't go to sleep here. And then Tom Flaherty. He had been the one whose wife Elaine had died earlier. Carla's first 2 sessions with Trance took place because she was helping Elaine to contact Tom in order to let him know all was well after she died. So those were the 3 people who came. We thought Andrea Puharich was coming at one point and even George Hunt Williamson, but neither of those did actually come. So, Leonard fell asleep. Not ideal, Leonard, but understandable. I'm pretty sure Jim has said that Leonard is the type of person who liked to meditate laying down. So, he was laying down in the room and he conked out. And whoops. But clearly everything was okay. It's just better if you're there to be focusing on the work at hand. So that was session 22. Session 22 was another session with a lot of historical information, not a lot of commentary from me on a lot of these questions and answers because it's kind of specific, but Ra doesn't seem to have a problem with this line of questioning. They don't mention it. There is one point where they did, or maybe there were 2 questions where they didn't start with I am Ra, and a lot of the times in the questions when they don't start with I am Ra, it's because there's a slight detuning happening. And so in those sessions, I make sure to say, to not say I am Ra. I just say something like, and then Ra says, then Ra said, because I think it's important to have some notation of that because it does mean something when Ra doesn't have that initial greeting. But in general, Ra comments more on the sleeping person than on the alignments in this session. So yeah, still some interesting information about Atlantis and about Confederation's interventions with humans and the ramifications of that, and putting that into perspective, I think, is an important part of balancing what Ra has given us here. But otherwise, I do think that is it for session 22, and I am, as always, super grateful for all of you, super grateful to our creator, and just super grateful for the lovely experience that we get to share together. And I look forward to reading session 23 next, and I will see you all then.